Jacob Hayes was a curious 12-year-old boy who unknowingly stumbled into the most dangerous secret his family was hiding. His father, Mark Hayes, a respected local businessman, had built a life based on lies and criminal dealings. His mother, Lisa, played the role of the loving wife, but she too was tangled in a web of corruption. When Jacob's body was found in a Georgia landfill, the small town of Brookhaven would be torn apart by shocking revelations, marking the beginning of a tragic tale of betrayal, manipulation, and the dark secrets that had been hidden for years. Who could have known that a family tragedy would lead to uncovering one of the most chilling criminal conspiracies ever to shake their community? The small, peaceful town of Brookhaven, Georgia, seemed like the ideal place for a family to live. Quiet streets lined with neatly manicured lawns, children riding bikes down cul-de-sacs, and neighbors who waved to each other as they passed by. Brookhaven was the type of community where everyone knew everyone. The Hayes family had lived here for years. Mark Hayes, the father, ran a modest local business while his wife Lisa worked as a nurse at the nearby hospital. They had 2 children, but their youngest, 12-year-old Jacob, was the heart of this family. A bright, curious boy, Jacob had a passion for reading mystery novels, collecting old coins, and dreaming about becoming a detective one day. He was well liked at school, had a tight-knit group of friends, and by all accounts seemed to have a happy, normal life. But that peace was shattered on a summer afternoon in 2019. Jacob had been out playing in the backyard, riding his bike, around the block like he often did, when he suddenly disappeared. It was a typical afternoon, with the sun casting long shadows over the neighborhood. But by the time the clock struck 6 p.m., Jacob had not returned home. His parents, initially, assuming he was just out with friends or distracted by some other adventure, didn't panic right away. But as the hours ticked on and the sun dipped below the horizon, the unease began to settle in. The family began to search the house, the backyard, and the surrounding blocks. No sign of Jacob. The panic began to set in when Mark drove around the neighborhood, asking neighbors if they had seen his son. No one had. Lisa called the local police, and within minutes, officers arrived to start their investigation. They asked the family if Jacob had ever run away, or if there were any issues at home. Mark and Lisa both denied it, insisting that Jacob had no reason to leave. The police, sensing the gravity of the situation, began a more formal search. They canvassed the area, knocking on doors and speaking to anyone who might have seen something out of the ordinary, but there were no solid leads. By the next day, news of Jacob's disappearance had spread throughout the town. Flyers were posted around Brookhaven, and social media pages were flooded with pictures of the missing boy. People organized search parties, but nothing came up. The investigation seemed to stall. There were no witnesses, no evidence, and no clues pointing to where Jacob might have gone. The only thing anyone knew for sure was that for some reason, the world had just become a little less safe. What began as a missing persons case quickly became a heart-wrenching mystery that no one could explain. As the days turned into weeks, the search for Jacob Hayes grew more desperate. The police had followed every lead they could find, but nothing brought them any closer to the missing boy. The local news stations picked up the story, and the town of Brookhaven, usually so quiet and uneventful, was now consumed by the mystery of Jacob's disappearance. Everyone knew someone who knew the Hayes family, and in a town like this, everyone was talking. Neighbors, classmates, even distant relatives of the Hayes family. Everyone had a theory about where Jacob could be. The police interviewed the boy's friends, but they could provide no concrete information. Jacob had been acting as normal the day before he vanished, and no one had seen anything unusual. The Hayes family, though clearly devastated, kept a united front. Mark and Lisa repeatedly spoke to the press, begging for their son's safe return, and offering a reward for any information leading to his whereabouts. But despite their pleas, the investigation went nowhere. A few weeks into the search, an anonymous tip came in. The call was brief, cryptic, and offered nothing concrete. The voice on the other end of the line didn't say much, but mentioned a location, an abandoned house just outside of town. The caller claimed to have seen something suspicious there, something that could be connected to Jacob's disappearance. At first, the police were skeptical, dismissing the tip as a prank, but with nothing else to go on, they decided to check it out. They arrived at the location late one afternoon, the overgrown property hidden away from the main roads. The house was decaying, windows boarded up and the air heavy with the smell of rotting wood and neglect. There were no signs of recent activity, but as they searched the area, one of the officers found something buried in the dirt near the front steps. It was a backpack, soaked from a recent rainstorm and covered in mud. At first glance, it seemed like just another piece of discarded junk, but as the officer pulled it from the ground, his heart sank. The backpack was clearly Jacob's. It had his name written in black marker on the inside flap, and his school supplies were still inside. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. It was the first solid piece of evidence they had found, but it raised even more questions. Why was Jacob's backpack dumped here? What did it mean? The police quickly began to investigate the house and surrounding area more thoroughly, hoping to find something that could lead them to the missing boy. But there was no sign of Jacob, just the haunting reminder of his last known belongings, left behind in a place that felt eerily disconnected from everything they knew about him. The backpack wasn't just a clue, it was a symbol of the growing mystery. It told the authorities that Jacob hadn't just disappeared on his own. Someone had to know something. Whoever had left the backpack clearly had information about where Jacob might be, but it wasn't clear whether they were trying to help or mislead the investigation. One thing was certain, though. The case had just taken a dark turn, and the search for answers was only just beginning. As the discovery of Jacob's backpack echoed through the investigation, the police began to shift their focus. The more they examined the backpack, the more they realized that this wasn't just some random act. The question now was, why had Jacob's belongings been left in such an obscure place? Why hadn't he taken his backpack with him? Or why hadn't it been found closer to home? The realization that the boy might have been deliberately hidden, or worse, discarded, made the case even more chilling. With few leads to follow, the police turned their attention to the Hayes family, specifically Mark and Lisa. The town had rallied around them, offering support and sympathy, but there was an undercurrent of curiosity building. The idea that the parents might somehow be involved in Jacob's disappearance was a difficult one to entertain, but in high-stakes investigations like this, no stone could be left unturned. The authorities started with the basics: background, checks, interviews, and family history. Mark Hayes, the father, had always been a well-known figure in Brookhaven. His business, a small but successful logistics company, had been in the area for years. By all accounts, he was a reliable businessman, someone who provided well for his family and was involved in the local community. His wife, Lisa, worked as a nurse at a nearby hospital. She had a reputation for being calm, reserved, and private, a woman who kept to herself and rarely socialized. Neighbors described her as quiet, but friendly, nothing that suggested any issues at home. However, as investigators dug deeper, they found that there were aspects of Mark's life that weren't as straightforward as they seemed. While his business was legitimate on the surface, there were whispers about his connections to some less than legal dealings. He had a handful of acquaintances in the local business world who were known for operating on the fringes of the law, and one name kept coming up: Nate Freeman. Freeman was a well-established figure in the area, with a reputation for handling shady investments and questionable ventures. He had been known to make money in ways that didn't quite fit the rules, and his name was frequently linked to local crime syndicates, though nothing concrete had ever been proven. The connection between Mark and Nate was subtle at first, but it was enough to raise alarms. Mark and Nate had been seen together on several occasions, talking in hushed voices at local bars or behind closed doors at business meetings. They had reportedly collaborated on a few business ventures over the years, though no one knew the exact nature of these projects. The more the police investigated, the more they realized that Mark's ties to Freeman, and the kinds of people Freeman associated with, could be more significant than they had initially imagined. The discovery of Jacob's backpack now seemed to take on a different meaning. Could Mark have been involved in something far darker than anyone knew? Had Jacob accidentally stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to see? The authorities had no concrete proof, but the connections to Freeman and the suspicious circumstances surrounding Jacob's disappearance left them with more questions than answers. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that the mystery surrounding Jacob's disappearance was only the tip of the iceberg, and the deeper they dug, the more sinister it seemed. It turned out that Mark's company had been used as a front for smuggling goods, a fact that he had carefully hidden from the public eye. The police found shipments of unmarked containers that were linked to illegal products, drugs, counterfeit, electronics, and even stolen artifacts, all of which had passed through Mark's logistics firm. The more the investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that Jacob's death wasn't just about a father trying to cover his tracks. It seemed that Jacob had somehow stumbled upon something much larger than he could have imagined. Jacob was known to be curious, intelligent, and eager to understand the world around him, which may have made him an unwitting witness to his father's illegal activities. Had he discovered something he wasn't supposed to know? Had he seen something that had threatened to expose the criminal operations Mark was hiding? The most chilling theory that emerged was that Jacob had learned too much, perhaps by overhearing conversations or stumbling upon his father's records. The idea that Jacob was a threat to his father's illicit empire sent a shudder through the investigators. Could Mark have been involved in his son's death to silence him? It was a possibility that no one wanted to consider, but it seemed to be the most logical explanation, given the mounting evidence against him. Meanwhile, the police were not the only ones who had started putting together the pieces of the puzzle. Lisa Hayes, Jacob's mother, had remained mostly silent during the investigation, her grief evident, but her involvement in the case minimal. However, when she was confronted with the findings from the toxicology reports, her demeanor changed. She seemed to falter, her face betraying a mixture of confusion, fear, and something more difficult to read: guilt. Lisa had always been a private person, but now it seemed as though her detachment was more than just emotional distance. Could she have known what was happening? Was she complicit in the secrets Mark had been hiding? The authorities began to question her more rigorously, though she denied any knowledge of her husband's criminal activities. But as the investigation continued, the focus remained on Mark. The more they dug into his dealings with Freeman and the criminal syndicate, the more it became clear that the scope of the corruption was far-reaching. Mark had been involved in money laundering, trafficking, and possibly even murder, all under the guise of legitimate business. The realization that Jacob's death might have been a casualty of this dark underworld left the investigators stunned, but they knew that the full extent of the crime had yet to be uncovered. There was a larger story here, one that involved not just a father's betrayal, but an entire criminal network that had been operating under the radar for years. Jacob's tragic death had set in motion a chain of events that would unravel the secrets of the Hayes family, exposing the hidden world of crime that had been lurking just beneath the surface of this seemingly quiet suburban town. With the forensic evidence pointing to the involvement of organized crime, the question of why Jacob had to die was no longer just about a missing child. It was about a dark conspiracy that would shake the town to its very core. As the investigation gained momentum, new evidence continued to surface, and the scope of Jacob's death became more sinister. The police had already established a link between Mark Hayes' business dealings and Nate Freeman's criminal syndicate, but there were still many unknowns. One of the most baffling aspects of the case was the silence from Lisa Hayes, Jacob's mother. Throughout the investigation, Lisa had remained mostly in the background, a grieving mother who seemed to have little to offer in terms of information. But as the investigation turned more inward, it became clear that her silence could no longer be ignored. Lisa had always been a somewhat distant figure, quietly supportive of her husband, and focused on her work as a nurse. She was not known for sharing personal details about her life, keeping her family's struggles and triumphs private. But as the police began to delve deeper into Mark's connections, they found that Lisa might have known more than she was letting on. Her emotional detachment began to raise suspicions, especially after the toxicology reports revealed the unusual chemical found in Jacob's bloodstream, an item tied to the smuggling operations Mark was involved with. The authorities decided to re-interview Lisa, hoping that time and the pressure of the investigation would loosen her resolve. During the second round of questioning, they noticed a shift in her behavior. She was no longer the calm, composed woman who had spoken to the press in the early days of Jacob's disappearance. Now, there was an unease in her answers, a defensiveness that hadn't been there before. When questioned about her knowledge of Mark's business dealings, Lisa initially denied any involvement. But the more the detectives pressed her, the more contradictions began to surface. Lisa's story about her relationship with Mark began to unravel. She claimed to have no knowledge of her husband's criminal activities, but it soon became apparent that she had been aware of at least some aspects of his dealings. Lisa had spent years working as a nurse, often in high-stress, high-risk environments, and it was hard to believe that she had never suspected anything unusual about Mark's business. It wasn't until the investigators uncovered more damning evidence, an old set of bank records, a series of encrypted emails on Mark's laptop, that the truth began to emerge. These records showed that Lisa had been involved in the cover-up of her husband's operations. It seemed that she had been complicit in his crimes, actively helping to hide illicit money transfers, and even coordinating shipments for him under the guise of her nursing career. She had been working with Mark to keep the family's criminal activities hidden, and while she may not have been as directly involved in the violent side of the operation, she was undoubtedly a key player in keeping it all under wraps. Lisa's role in the cover-up didn't end there. In fact, it was becoming increasingly clear that she had played a more significant part in Jacob's death than anyone had imagined. The police found evidence that suggested Lisa had been aware of the dangers Jacob had unknowingly been exposed to. There were signs that she had tried to keep him away from certain areas of the house, away from places where her husband's illegal operations took place. Yet, despite her best efforts, Jacob had still uncovered secrets that had threatened to destroy the fragile world they had built. Had Lisa known that her son was in danger? Had she tried to shield him from it? Or had she turned a blind eye thinking he wouldn't understand the full extent of her husband's criminal activities? The idea that Lisa might have been complicit in her son's death was a bitter pill to swallow, but the evidence was hard to ignore. The investigators began to focus on her actions in the days leading up to Jacob's disappearance. Lisa's behavior seemed to suggest that she was trying to protect Mark, even if it meant keeping secrets from the police and allowing her son to be caught in the crossfire of a criminal underworld that had spun out of control. As more pieces of the puzzle fell into place, it became clear that the Hayes family was entangled in a web of corruption and deceit that stretched far beyond Brookhaven. The idea that a mother could be complicit in the death of her own child was heartbreaking, but the evidence was undeniable. Lisa had been hiding something far more dangerous than anyone had realized. The investigation had uncovered a much larger conspiracy than anyone had expected, and it was clear that Jacob's death was not just the result of his father's criminal activities. There was a much darker story behind it, one that involved betrayal, manipulation, and a mother who may have been willing to sacrifice everything to protect her family's secrets. As the investigation delved deeper into the secrets of the Hayes family, it became increasingly clear that Mark and Lisa's involvement in Jacob's death was only a small piece of a much larger puzzle. The revelation of Lisa's complicity in the cover-up had shocked the community, but it was the discovery of the criminal network operating behind the scenes that truly turned the case into something beyond anyone's imagination. The more the police uncovered, the more they realized that Jacob's death wasn't just about his father's hidden life. It was a tragedy tied to a powerful, far-reaching crime syndicate that had been quietly influencing the town for years. While Mark Hayes had been operating under the radar, using his logistics company as a front for smuggling and money laundering, the syndicate he was involved with was far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The police had already connected Nate Freeman to the group, but the true extent of Freeman's operation was more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. As investigators continued to track the flow of illegal goods and money through Mark's business, they uncovered a chilling network of corruption that stretched from the heart of Georgia all the way to international crime rings. The evidence pointed to a smuggling operation that dealt not only in counterfeit electronics and drugs, but also in human trafficking. Mark's company had been a crucial part of moving people across state lines, hiding them in plain sight among the legitimate shipments of goods. The discovery that Jacob's father had been involved in such a horrific crime shocked the investigators, but what was even more disturbing was the thought that Jacob might have been exposed to this world without fully understanding it. While the police had focused much of their attention on Mark and Lisa, they were beginning to piece together a much darker and more complex story. The Hayes family was caught in a network that involved not just smuggling, but exploitation, violence, and manipulation. Mark had been a key player in this operation, helping to facilitate the movement of people and goods, while Nate Freeman and others in the syndicate provided the muscle and resources. But what no one had yet realized was that Jacob's death wasn't just a consequence of his father's crimes, it was a direct result of the syndicate's ruthless nature. As the investigation took shape, the police began to consider the possibility that Jacob's death was not just a case of a boy stumbling upon his father's secrets. The more they learned, the more it appeared that Jacob had been targeted. The rare chemical found in his system, the hidden body, the strange circumstances surrounding his disappearance, it all pointed to the idea that Jacob had been killed to silence him, not just because he had discovered too much, but because he was a potential threat to the syndicate's operations. The investigators uncovered evidence that Jacob had somehow become aware of the human trafficking aspect of his father's business. It was still unclear how he had learned about it, but he had become suspicious of the people his father associated with, often asking questions that were far beyond the curiosity of a typical 12-year-old. Jacob had seen things he wasn't supposed to, and the more the police dug into his personal belongings, the more they found that he had been writing down notes about strange shipments he had overheard his father discussing. These notes were discovered hidden inside his room, tucked away, in a notebook that Jacob had kept for months. His drawings and writings spoke of a big business that didn't seem right, with names and places he had pieced together from overheard conversations. It was becoming clear that Jacob had been more aware of his father's world than anyone had given him credit for. His curiosity had led him to uncover something dangerous, and as the pieces of the investigation fell into place, it seemed that Jacob had become a target, not just because of his proximity to the criminal activities, but because he had threatened to expose them. The authorities began to believe that Mark Hayes had been forced into a corner, with his son unknowingly gathering information that could unravel everything he had built. The only way to protect the syndicate was to silence Jacob once and for all. The investigation was moving quickly now, but it was far from over. The discovery of Jacob's notes, coupled with the links between Mark's logistics company and the international trafficking ring, painted a chilling picture of how deeply the Hayes family had been involved in this dark network. The more they uncovered, the more it seemed as though the entire town had been unknowingly complicit in the criminal empire that had operated in the shadows for so long. But the bigger question still remained. How many more families had been affected by this syndicate, and who else in Brookhaven had been pulling the strings? The investigation had revealed just the tip of the iceberg, and now the police knew they were only beginning to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy. As the investigation progressed, the police found themselves facing a deeper and more disturbing web of corruption than anyone could have anticipated. The Hayes family, once seen as a quiet suburban household, had turned out to be at the center of a vast criminal network, and the tragic death of 12-year-old Jacob was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The revelations continued to pile up, and with each new discovery, the investigators felt the weight of the case pressing down on them. One of the most shocking turns in the case came when new information revealed that Mark Hayes wasn't just working with Nate Freeman, but had been in contact with influential figures within local law enforcement. The investigation had initially suspected that Freeman was the mastermind behind much of the criminal activity, but now it appeared that Mark had been using his connections within the police to protect his operations. The revelation of these ties sent shockwaves through the department. How many officers were involved in turning a blind eye to Mark's dealings? How many were complicit in allowing the criminal syndicate to thrive? The deeper the police dug, the more they discovered. It wasn't just that Mark had been using his business as a cover for smuggling and money laundering. He had been using his position as a respected businessman to gain favors, influence, and even immunity from law enforcement scrutiny. The syndicate had been operating under the radar for years, with Mark's logistics company serving as the perfect front to move both illegal goods and people. The Hayes family had carefully built their lives to keep up appearances, but behind closed doors, they were living a double life. one that was deeply entangled with organized crime. Lisa Hayes, once thought to be a passive participant, was now revealed to have been an active player in this criminal network. Evidence from her phone, along with emails recovered from her computer, suggested that she had been working closely with the Syndicate. She had been complicit not only in helping to cover up her husband's operations but also in facilitating the movement of illegal goods. It was now clear that Lisa had known more than anyone had initially believed. She had been part of the operation for years, carefully hiding her involvement behind the facade of her nursing career. But it was the discovery of her communication with Freeman's associates that revealed the extent of her participation. Despite the growing body of evidence, the police were still no closer to understanding why Jacob had been murdered. His death, it seemed, was no longer just an accidental byproduct of his father's criminal life. It was something much more deliberate. The investigators now believed that Jacob had been killed to stop him from exposing his father's secret life. But there was still the question of how involved Lisa was in the decision to silence him. Had she played a role in the planning of her son's death, or had she been unaware of the murder that had been carried out in her own home? The timeline of events surrounding Jacob's disappearance was becoming clearer. It seemed likely that Jacob had discovered something about the Syndicate, something so dangerous that it posed a direct threat to their operations. The notes found in his room and the conversations he had overheard suggested that he had come across vital information about his father's criminal ties. He had unknowingly pieced together the puzzle of his father's dealings with Freeman and the trafficking network, and in doing so, he had become a liability that could not be allowed to live. The investigators began to hypothesize that Mark and Lisa had come to a decision together. Jacob had to die to protect the family's secrets. The more they uncovered about the Hayes family's activities, the more it seemed that Mark had been willing to do whatever it took to protect his position within the Syndicate. The police now had to confront the painful possibility that Jacob's death was not just the result of his father's desperation. It was the result of a cold, calculated decision made by both parents to protect their dark empire. The investigation was nearing its breaking point. The police had enough evidence to bring Mark and Lisa Hayes in for questioning, but the full scale of the conspiracy was still not fully understood. How many others were involved in the Syndicate? Who had been helping to cover up the murder? What other families had been torn apart by the shadow of this criminal organization? The deeper they dug, the more it seemed like the entire town was complicit in some way or another. But with the Hayes family at the center of it all, it was clear that the final chapter of this tragedy was far from over. As the authorities prepared to make their move, they knew that the truth they were about to expose would shock the entire community and reveal a level of corruption that no one had imagined. As the investigation reached its climax, the police knew they were on the verge of uncovering the full scope of a conspiracy that had been festering under the surface of the once peaceful town of Brookhaven. The Hayes family, once seen as just another suburban household, had proven to be at the heart of a criminal empire that spanned far beyond local smuggling and money laundering. Now, with both Mark and Lisa Hayes under heavy suspicion, the final pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. The chilling truth about their involvement in Jacob's death was about to be revealed. But the investigation had one last shocking twist in store. The authorities had gathered enough evidence to arrest both Mark and Lisa, but the case was far from simple. Mark had been a master manipulator, using his charm and influence to gain the trust of not only the community, but also local law enforcement. His connections ran deep, and the more the police dug, the more they realized just how far the corruption had spread. With so many powerful people in the town linked to the criminal syndicate, it became a race against time to ensure that the investigation didn't stall due to outside pressures. In a series of coordinated efforts, the police managed to arrest Mark Hayes on charges of trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. Lisa Hayes was also taken into custody, though her role in the murder of Jacob was still a point of contention. It became clear that while Lisa had been complicit in her husband's criminal activities, her involvement in Jacob's death was murkier. Was she simply a pawn in Mark's empire,